My dad is 84 and a half years old, and he's got dark black hair. You know, you'd never know that he was 84 and a half years old, not just because of the dark black hair, but last winter, he was up on the roof of his house, shoveling off 4 feet of snow. Right? And this summer, he went out kayaking with me. He actually grew up on a farm during the Depression and war years. And after graduating high school, he worked on his uncle's farm. And then he gave that up to work for the telephone company, and he did that for over 30 years. But he never gave up working with the soil, working in the earth. I remember when I was growing up, my dad was always out in the vegetable garden or the flower beds pulling out weeds. And he said that it was good for him, because as he pulled out weeds, literally, he was metaphorically pulling out weeds that he was dealing with at work and just tossing them away. You know, he's retired now, but he still has not one, but 2 vegetable gardens and many flower beds all over his yard. Not only that, but he has an extensive woodworking collection down in his basement that keeps him busy during the cold months, which, by the way, tend to be quite a few, because this is Buffalo, New York, after all. So occasionally I ask him, "Hey, Dad, can you make some woodworking projects for me?" And you know, he's just thrilled to do it for me, just thrilled. And a couple of weeks ago, I had a birthday. And I asked him, "Hey, Dad, could you make me a meditation or a prayer bench?" And you know what? He did. And this is what he came up with. And this is how it works. You put it down behind you, and you sit down like that. And I use it for my daily practice of centering prayer. Prayer. That's the subject for this week's study of Barbara Taylor's book, An Altar in the World. Actually, she titles the chapter, "The Practice of Being Present to God." She starts off by saying, actually, that she's a failure at prayer. You know, I kind of found this reassuring, because I've been around centering prayer circles for about 7 or 8 years now, around people that do prayer a lot. I mean, a real lot. And you know what? Nobody says that they're good at it. In fact, saying that you're good at prayer is kind of saying that you've mastered it, kind of like an athlete would master a sport, or a musician would master an instrument. And you know, prayer just isn't like that. If you go through the classics on prayer, they say that prayer is not something that will lead you to mastery. It's something that will lead you through confusion to a deeper reality. Just look at some of the titles. There's the 14th century classic, The Cloud of Unknowing. Not the Sun of Knowing, the Cloud of Unknowing. And this just happens to be the work that centering prayer is based on. Then you have St. John of the Cross's works in the 16th century, one of which is titled The Dark Night of the Soul. And the list goes on and on. It's not that people can't see in the cloudiness or the darkness. It's that through prayer, you learn to see differently. You use different faculties to be able to see in the dark. You have to unknow before you know. Many of the mystics resort to poetry because language simply hinders rather than explains this new way of visionary seeing. Barbara Brown Taylor realizes this too, after spending almost the entire chapter talking about prayer. She says, and I quote, "Prayer is a practice, not a discussion topic." Well then, great. What's a guy supposed to do who volunteers to give a sermon on prayer? Right? What's a guy supposed to do if he wants to go and talk about being present to God? Well, it seemed to me that if prayer is a practice and not a discussion topic, then let's talk about practice. And I thought it would be good for me to share with you my daily practice of centering prayer. Now, centering prayer was actually developed in the 1970s by a Trappist monk at Spencer Abbey in Spencer, Massachusetts, not too far away from here, just outside of Worcester. One of the biggest writers on centering prayer is Father Thomas Keating, who at the time was the abbot at that monastery. First, centering prayer. Centering prayer is a prayer done in silence. Now, silence weaves its way all throughout the Bible. In Habakkuk, he says, "Let all the earth keep silent before the Lord." The psalmist sings out, "My soul in silence waits." And then you get to Isaiah. Isaiah gets right to the point. Sit in silence. And then we get to Jesus' words, words that we heard this morning. When talking about prayer, Jesus says, "Do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard because of their many words." So when you do centering prayer, you sit in silence, normally for a period of about 20 minutes. Your intention, and centering prayer is all about intention. Your intention during that 20 minutes is to be open to God, open to Source. The funny thing is that before you know it, your mind is off racing. Even though your intentions were admirable to stay in silence and to be open to God, your mind is clattering away. The Buddhists call this the monkey mind. Our mind is like monkeys, clattering and running around in the canopy of the trees. What then is a person supposed to do? How do we put teeth in our intention to stay present to God, to open ourselves up to Source? In centering prayer, you use what's called a sacred word. Whenever you find yourself caught up in a thought, you simply but silently say your sacred word. You could have a religious word, like Jesus, or Abba, or Mary, or Mother, or Spirit. Or you could have a word that reflects a state that you want to be in, like peace, or be still, or let go. There's nothing sacred about the word itself. What's sacred is what you do with the word. It acts just like a string that you might tie around your finger when you're in the middle of your thought. Oh yeah, wasn't I trying to be open to God? So centering prayer is basically a surrender practice. Every time you say your word, you're choosing to let go of whatever you're focused on and returning to that intention that you started with, the intention to be open to God. Thomas Keating, as I said, the major figure behind centering prayer, likens this process to the image of a scuba diver going deeper and deeper into the water. All of a sudden, the diver will find herself caught up in a thought, and all of a sudden, she's back to the surface of the water. So she says her sacred word and returns to the depths. As it says in Psalm 42:7, deep calls unto deep. The deepest part of ourselves is communing with the depths of the divine. In order to go deeper, we surrender. Throughout the prayer, you're essentially doing this gesture. You have a thought, and you let go. Huh? So everyone, I want you to do this gesture with me. You ready? Put your hands up like this. There you go. You guys are great. If you can do that, you can do centering prayer. Okay? It's all about letting go, surrendering, and that's the gesture that you have when you say your sacred word. You know, there's a famous story about a nun. A nun who went to Thomas Keating's introductory workshop on centering prayer, and you know, she was concerned that she couldn't do it. So after a 20-minute sit, she said, "Oh, Father Keating, I am a failure at this prayer. In 20 minutes, I've had 10,000 thoughts." And Father Keating said to her, without missing a beat, "How wonderful. 10,000 opportunities to return to God." So, centering prayer is basically a win-win activity. If you had a 20-minute period of just a few thoughts, then you've had a wonderful time resting in presence. If you had a period of 10,000 thoughts, then it too is wonderful, because you're able to strengthen your surrender muscle of returning to presence. The nun found the words of Father Keating reassuring because there was nothing she could do wrong in the prayer. She was reassured that she could find those pesky thoughts as an opportunity to surrender. As a gift, actually. Barbara Brown Taylor in her book also talks about surrender, but by means of expressing how much of our life is actually out of our control. She even says that many of our own decisions rarely take us to where we want to go. She's actually a little vulnerable in the book and says that many of her decisions turned out completely differently. She ultimately let go of control and chose to take life as an unmitigated gift. You know, I can just hear Father Keating saying in the background of Barbara Brown Taylor's choice, "How wonderful. 10,000 decisions turning up differently are 10,000 opportunities to return to God and to see life just as thoughts, as a gift." I think Barbara Brown Taylor and Father Keating are saying the same thing. Prayer changes one's perspective. You know, I'd have to say that centering prayer has changed my perspective. It's changed the way I approach life. It's even changed the way I read and hear the Bible. So let's look at the Lord's Prayer that we just heard. Jesus was teaching his disciples how to pray. Christopher Page, an Episcopal priest in British Columbia, took a close look at the verb to pray. Since Jesus spoke Aramaic, he looked at what the Aramaic word is. In Aramaic, the word to pray is shalu, which also means to open. So when Jesus teaches his disciples how to pray, he's teaching them how to be open. He's teaching them how to be open to another reality, to another way of being. So Jesus begins the prayer by saying, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." For Jesus, Father means source. Our Father who art in heaven is our source of being. That's why Jesus says, so seemingly shockingly, such things as, "Unless you hate your father and mother, you cannot be my disciple." Jesus isn't saying that we have to literally hate our parents, but rather we have to realize our true divine source. You know, I love reading the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas, it's not just because my son is named Thomas, but it's a gospel that has some of the same sayings as Jesus, but they have a little bit different twist to them. In Thomas's gospel, Jesus says, "My mother brought me forth, but truth gave me life." We have to surrender. Surrender the idea of our earthly parents being our only source. We have to surrender and open up to the truth of our divine origin. Jesus continues with, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Jesus is saying that it is thy will, O Lord, O God, not my will. Remember how in the final moments before his crucifixion, Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane and he said, "Not my will, but thy will be done." Both in the Lord's Prayer and in his life, Jesus says that it's not his will. Jesus shows that life should be lived out of surrender. It's interesting that centering prayer is sometimes referred to as the Gethsemane prayer. Jesus' own Gethsemane prayer allowed him to surrender, which eventually created the possibility of new life through resurrection. Centering prayer reminds us to surrender, which can give us the flexibility to see new possibilities in our own lives. Jesus moves on to, "Give us this day our daily bread." Why does it have to be daily bread? Why can't it just say, "Give us bread"? Well, it's reminiscent of the story of the Israelites. When they were wandering around in the desert, God gave them bread or manna from heaven. Each morning, they could pick up the manna off the ground like dew on the grass. But Moses warned them to only take a certain amount to get them through the day. Those who were unable to get the allotted amount of food found that they had more than enough to get them through the day. But some of them didn't listen to what Moses had to say. They hoarded up the manna just in case it wasn't going to come the next morning, only to find out that it was foul and full of worms after one day. You know, what's the opposite of surrender? The opposite of surrender is this. It's hoarded. And Moses is saying, you have to let go. You can't hoard up these things. Apparently, they didn't trust. They didn't trust that God would provide them for them daily. They needed to surrender their need for control, surrender their need for security and survival. They needed to open up to God's daily abundance. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. You know, when I think of debts, I think of a balance sheet. You know, sometimes you can go through life. Well, let's see. Ralph didn't say hi to me in the hallway, -2. Mary gave me apples off of her tree, +5. Right? Jesus is saying, get rid of the balance sheet. Right? For me, centering prayer is a practice in forgiving others. It's not rare to be sitting in silence and have a thought of a real or perceived offense come in. Sitting there, I can have a thought of, the principal calling me into her office and chewing me out, right? Minus 53. But you just let go in the prayer. The thought comes up, you surrender it to the divine. And what happens? One lets go of the debt and offers it to God, who, in his infinitude, can accept all. And then, if the offense needs to be addressed, one can do it from a deeper, surrendered place. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. You know, some people who do centering prayer have problems with trust. They just had a hard time, based on their upbringing, dealing with this idea of trust. But the constant motions of letting go engender a sense of trust, a sense of faith. You would never be able to let go if you didn't think that there was something deeper below you to hold you up. And Jesus shows us in this prayer that we can trust that God will lead us to a place that we can handle, a place that will not lead us into temptation. For me, it's not surprising that those dedicated to a life of prayer, a life of opening themselves up to the presence of God, can naturally open themselves up in life. In Acts, we see exactly this. We see people who, amongst other things, were devoting themselves to prayer. And we see the fruits of this. They were open to surrendering their possessions and distributing to all who were in need. They gathered together with generous hearts. Openness leads to the possibility of surrender. Surrender leads to trust. Trust leads to faith. Faith leads to generosity and compassion. Openness, prayer, our intention to be open to God, permits the possibility for surrender. Surrender leads to trust. You would not be able to surrender if you didn't have trust. And the constant motion of surrendering brings trust bigger. Trust leads to faith. You know in a deeper way that there's something there. And faith leads to compassion and generosity. You know, Barbara Brown Taylor uses the last part of her chapter to talk about people of different traditions who, like the people in Acts, start off with this. Start off with openness. Start off with devoting their lives to prayer. As I read her account, I noticed a thread running through all of them, all of the different traditions. They had some kind of sacred movement or sacred gesture going on. She talks about the Greek Orthodox Church that engaged in reverent gestures. She mentions the Vedanta Center, where people sit in lotus positions on a cushion. And she ends up with a piece de résistance. She ends up with an account of those at a Muslim mosque who use their whole body to bow to the divine. You know, one night she decided, I'm going to give it a try. She goes into her bedroom and she gets down on the floor, all the way on the floor. And she says, my posture said it all. She didn't need to use words. Her posture said it all. She continued by saying, I was not just in prayer, I was under prayer, entirely submerged in the act of surrendering my whole self to God. My teacher in centering prayer, Cynthia Bourgeau, also talks about the importance of posture, the importance of sacred gesture. At one of our retreats a couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago, I found out that there's one of her advanced students who lives right here in the Boston area. His name is Stephen, and he's kind of a bigwig in the Episcopal Church. I had his email, but you know, I never got the courage to email him. I mean, what was I gonna say? Hey, you wanna talk about centering prayer? Or, would you like to be my friend? You know, I just didn't know what to say to him. But you know, in June, just this past June, I went on a retreat, and guess who was there? Why, it was Stephen. We ended up talking, and I plan on attending a practice circle at his house in Cambridge once a month. It's a practice circle because remember, as Barbara Brown Taylor says, prayer is practice, not a discussion topic. But I also watched him. I would just sit there and watch him during the retreat. It was obvious that he took postures and gestures seriously. When we sat down to do our centering prayer sits together, he whipped out his meditation bench, similar to that one, and sat kneeling right down. And after our sits were done, he bowed his whole body to the floor. This bigwig in the Episcopal Church bowing his whole body to the floor. You know, after I saw him, I knew that I too had to take posture and gesture seriously. So I went home and I Googled meditation benches. And I found a design for them, and I asked my dad, hey Dad, for my birthday, could you make me a meditation bench? And sure enough, he did, because he loves to do that stuff for me. So I'm going to take my meditation bench, and I'm going to put it on the table with all the other things we've collected this summer. And I'm going to put it there as a symbol for openness, as a symbol for opening to God, as a symbol of prayer, as a symbol of the importance of sacred gesture and sacred posture. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to end with a challenge. It's not the ice bucket challenge. I'm going to call it the sacred gesture challenge. And no, I'm not going to ask you to kneel. I'm not going to ask you to go on the ground and do a full body oblation. What I'm going to ask you to do is something a little more subtle, something that requires us to pay attention. So if prayer is to be open, and as Barbara Brown Taylor says, my posture said it all. I want us to pay attention this week to how our bodies are not open. When is our jaw clenched? When are we constricting? When is the intonation of our voice piercing? Maybe it's when somebody is dismissive. Maybe it's when the guy in the line in front of you is just taking too long. Maybe it's when you think somebody isn't listening to you. Notice in your body. Notice how you're constricting. And change. Change your posture. Move from clenched to open. Move from a sense of urgency to a sense of acceptance. And who knows? Who knows where it will lead us? Who knows? But maybe, just maybe, if we're paying enough attention, we'll be doing exactly what Paul insisted when he said, pray without ceasing. Amen.